Okay, we'll start up. Welcome. Thank you for being here. It's good to see everybody. We're starting on class number 7, believe it or not. I was surprised. I organized the videos. I'm going to put a link right now in the chat. So that link that just came up, drawingyourownpath.com/blog, B-L-O-G. That's where the previous 6 class recordings are. So nobody else knows but you guys. So I'll leave it to you guys to check them out and let me know if anyone goes and looks and has any suggestions, or if it runs okay, then let me know if they want to review previous classes. They're all there. Yeah. It's a little more involved than I thought to get them all up there, but there they are, 6, and I'm recording tonight, so we'll have 7. And I apologize for, the audio and video quality is what it is, but I'm working every week to improve that. So you will have a record, and I hope to put up notes, class notes, and things like that as I go. So that's there, that site. Okay. Tonight we're going to go a little bit further into this illusion of depth, this so-called realistic drawing. And we're going to talk about light and dark and shadow and shading and that sort of thing, with some classic examples of that. And probably my thinking is that we'll start to step away a little bit from realistic drawing, because usually one of my workshops online takes 6 weeks, and so we already exceeded that with just one topic. So I'll move. I want to move to some other things, but we'll continue to do exercises, and I'll introduce other aspects of realistic drawing as it comes up. Certainly, there's going to be some time spent on color at some point. But I do want to go into systematic drawing and improvisational drawing so people see the full scope of the practices, and then maybe we'll come back to some special topics and also hear from people. Again, I want to really just introduce a lot of practices to everyone and try for each person to find one that's really working for them that they can really get involved in. So yeah, you don't have to master everything. Should try everything out, and you never know. And then, one thing might really work out. Okay. Yeah, okay, so people are coming in. All right, so we're going to have an exercise. This is sort of the beginning. As we get going, this is like our stretching. This is our sort of warm-up exercise. And what I want to talk about is the difference between line and edge. Like my camera here is kind of going slowly. See if I can get to. Okay, sorry, I'm having a little feedback. There we go. Okay. All right. So that seems to be a little better. All right. So it's a simple exercise. The thing is, when you draw, like say you're going to draw a bottle or something like that.
Hey,
so we
John,
practiced this before, just making a little shape.
We all be.
Yeah.
Hey, John, should we be pulling up the DYOP page, see it rather than the view?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, I did. That's a good thing. Thanks for suggesting that. Yeah, so you could pin the DYOP window by clicking on the 3 little dots in the upper right. You can choose pin video. If everybody's muted, then speaker view should pull it up, but sometimes if someone talks, it'll pop away and it's confusing. So yeah, you could pin that. That would be cool. And yeah, and then pop off of gallery view. So you'll be able to see a little bit more. Okay, so this is like our outline, and what we've been mostly doing is these contour drawings, which are sort of outlines, and we've been reducing the edges of all the objects we've been looking at to lines, which is fine for getting the shape, getting the contour out, but When we want to talk about ways to represent volume, it's better to think about all these lines, not as lines, but as edges. And the way that we distinguish a line from an edge is that's a line. A line is a line. Let's see. It's kind of delayed in mine. I don't know if everybody's experiencing that delay. So that's a line. And then the edge is kind of just, you could say just thicker. And in this case, I'm having it be very dark right at the edge, as we saw in the value pattern of the cylinder. It's dark at the edge and then it gets lighter. And so that's the thing to practice. So we're just going to practice lines. And you can do it lines next to lines, or you can do it as shading, as pressing hard, and then a little lighter, and then a little lighter, and then a little lighter. And developing an edge that way. But also if you want to do it so that, let's say this is going to be the edge going this way, up and down, but you want to develop it by pressing hard and then soft and developing lines sort of perpendicular to the edge. Trying to be as even, consistent as possible, trying to make them sort of as close together as possible. Those are a little far apart just to show you the lines, but yeah, to develop an edge, we want to just make them really kind of close together. So lines emphasizing pressure and developing a plane instead of a line. I'll show you really quickly. I'll try to share a screen. There was one guy who was the master of this. There we go. See if you can see. You know this guy, this classic painting. If you read the Walter Isaacson's recent biography of Leonardo da Vinci, he discusses this quite a bit. There's a concept called sfumato, and actually it was a prompt in one week in the drawing bee when I read that book. I was so taken by the idea. And as I understand it, the word essentially means smoke. That's like sort of the literal meaning of the word. But the idea is that the edge sort of disappears like smoke, like how smoke disappears. And so around the lips of the Mona Lisa, certainly underneath the chin and neck, but also at lots of places in the background, places in the hand, the edge just kind of disappears. It just kind of, you can't quite tell where one thing ends and the other begins. It's sort of like smoke. Like, where does the smoke actually stop? That's one of the ideals of this kind of edge shading method, is to work in such a way. And he was able to sort of on the right side of the face and under the chin, you can't really tell where the edge of the chin stops and the neck starts. It's sort of in there, but you couldn't quite pinpoint it. And when you see it sort of blown up and really look at it, it's really quite amazing. And by leaving it ambiguous, your mind fills things in, and you form a shape, and it also kind of makes the whole thing float in a way. It gives it a kind of a mysterious air, all those sort of smoky edges. So there's the big example when you're thinking of edges, how to fade out those edges, fade them out so slowly that you can't quite tell when it stops. Okay, let me stop the sharing. Okay, and when you're doing it, another thing to pay attention to is, are you using the pencil grip? Are we using the regular pencil grip, or are we have a overhand grip or a more relaxed grip? Another one is to do this kind of a pinch like this. See if I can show you, yeah, like that. And to shade. And another thing to try is, some people imagine that there's a pin in the wrist like this, holding it, and they shade. They're very comfortable. They put a piece of paper under the arm as it rests on the page, and they pivot on the wrist. It's the people who discuss and teach the shading, they all have technique for how they get to be consistent. Another teacher will say, don't use the wrist, use the elbow or the shoulder, and that's another way to get nice long strokes. So it does depend on the size of the thing you're shading. And like everything, you just develop your technique eventually. What's going to be comfortable for the size you're working, for the space you're working, for your arm and shoulder. But if you're doing it right at the wrist and your wrist is moving around, this is moving around, kind of have a look at that. If you're how steady you're going. In the shading game, it's good to be very consistent. This is why Adobe Illustrator really works very well, because they have a setting called gradient, where you choose the endpoints and you choose the step size and the distance, and it basically does the fade for you. If you went from a black to a white, it would do the fade out for you on the edges. And so one real characteristic of Illustrator drawings that you see in publications are these incredible gradients everywhere. It's a way to get very, very good three-dimensional illusion. Okay, so we practiced that for a minute or so, but he's warmed up maybe. I'm going to get a new sheet. Now I'm going to give you the classic shading exercise, shading example, which is a sphere. So if you've done the sphere, could just pay attention to, begin doing the sphere and pay attention to how it's working. Maybe there's some little points here and there. Maybe you want to interject in your technique. If you've not done the sphere, the way we do it is we begin just with a circle. And again, rendering, sort of realistic drawing, is a very technical thing. So we're going to go and we're going to make like a diagram now, and we're going to label the parts of the sphere. The first thing in doing sphere shading is that we need to create a light source. So I'm going to create, this is just my little indicator of the light, and I'm going to show it's coming down here from the upper left. Everybody can see that. Okay. Now, the light's coming in that way. There'll be two basic sides to the sphere, or to anything we're going to shade, any shape we're going to shade. And the light, that's the light and the dark. The light side is divided from the dark side with what's called the Terminator. Sounds a little bit Arnold Schwarzenegger. The Terminator is the line between the light and the dark, and we can draw it. We could draw a straight line halfway across like that. We'll say, depending on where the light's coming in, it'll be like that, directly pointing to the light. But the sphere is the surface of the sphere is not flat like that. So we have to draw it a little bit curved, imagining that it's following the contour of the sphere. So we'll draw it a little bit curved like that. Now it depends on the height of the light source and how far back and how close it is, that the shape of this line. But for this exercise, yeah, a good general shape, slightly above halfway, works really well. And right below that, we're going to make this edge. So here we're going to start making this edge. So the edge you just practiced, we're just going to put that. So however you decided you could do that best, we're just going to put an edge there. One surprising thing about shading a sphere that was there for me to learn when I first took it up was that it was in my mind that the darkest part of the shadow was the furthest from the light. So I always had this edge be a little bit light, because yeah, there's some light there, and then get darker and darker as it went around toward the back of the sphere, toward the bottom of the sphere. But careful observation and also lots of people's examples online will show you that, in fact, the darkest part of the shadow is right at the Terminator, right here at this edge. So this is going to be your darkest. And coming back from that as we shade back from that, and you can shade with cross-hatching or whatever, but it's sometimes good to try to stay a little bit with the contour, if you can imagine it, of the sphere when you're making those little lines. Be a little bit cognizant. We're just going to keep bringing that edge back, but we're going to be getting a little bit lighter and a little bit lighter. And the reason that the sphere, the shadow is lighter toward the back is that what happens is that this light gets to this edge where this Terminator is, and it doesn't go past, but it does come around the sphere and bounce off the ground and reflects. So there is some reflected light. So the part, especially down close to the ground, if you do observation, you'll see that it's a little bit lighter there because light is reflecting off the ground. Now, we're going to get a little depth already in the sphere, and I'm going to start adjusting and making this a little bit darker. And what we'll end up with around the sides is sort of a mid-tone gray. You remember we made a little ramp last class, dark to light or light to dark with the cross-hatching. So the darkest parts are going to be right there at the Terminator. That's called the core, C-O-R-E, core shadow. And then down here toward the bottom, there's midtones. And then there's the reflected light. It's the reflected. So I've drawn a bunch of lines, but yeah, I can come back and make it a little more solid, filling in some lines. Maybe you're good at filling in the lines the whole time. Shading is one of those things that's a lot of fun to do, and there are a lot of variations. And of course, you find online people who are shading with all sorts of different marks. You can shade with boxes, you can shade with dots, you can shade with lines. Any shape you want can be overlaid and turned into a shading. Now, one thing to note is, as we noted with the cylinder, is when you get right down to the bottom edge, then you have this other effect coming in, which isn't that it's being reflected, although there is a little reflected light, but right down toward the bottom, it curves away, and so it's a little bit darker, and the reflected light doesn't quite penetrate into that area. So it does darken up a little bit toward the edge, the same way that the cylinder did. And that's for the same reason, that the shape curves away. Okay, and then in the light area, we're going to have some midtones. You got to be a little bit careful to make them light. And there's one place that is going to be very special, and that's going to be right about here, and that's the highlight. And so we don't want to put any mark in there. We want to be careful to leave a kind of a circular area with no with no tone at all in there. But we can put a little bit of tone, especially toward the edges, just to indicate. I'm going to shade it a little bit quickly, but okay, and you can work with that and sort of get the tones how you like them. So we start to get a little bit of dimensionality just from the light. So what do we have? The light source, we have the highlight, we have our midtones. our Terminator shadow. Another thing that's going to give us a sense of depth is to cast a shadow. So, how do we decide where the shadow goes? You can kind of feel it out just drawing underneath, but there are a couple of techniques too. There's not one great technique, but there's a couple of techniques. One technique is you can use a straight edge, or you can just estimate from the light source to the tangent of the sphere. The tangent is if you draw a line from the light source down to the bottom where it just hits the sphere once, and then you can do it over here. So I put my light pretty low, so that's going to cast the shadow way out. It's not even quite a good tangent. It kind of bends, but I don't want to get too far out. Anyway, and that gives you the idea that you can bring your shadow a little bit over to there, and then that shadow can cast way out because that light's very low. And the shadow has two parts. That right underneath the sphere, this is called occlusion. Shadow. And this part, which we just call shadow, is sometimes called the cast shadow. So if you are in a drawing class or get a book on drawing, you'll find this diagram quite commonly. And if you decided that you didn't know how to shade immediately, and that somehow you couldn't draw or you weren't talented about drawing, yeah, you just hadn't gotten the parts labeled. Nobody showed you the map yet. In fact, each of these parts, you can spend a lot of time perfecting the Terminator and the way you do the edge of the Terminator, the lightness of the cast shadow. So every part determines something about how it's represented. There's even more, but this is the major categories of the light. Another thing you can do to enhance the illusion of depth is we'll set this sphere on a surface, and the way you do that is take a point and draw like a horizon line. These are things we talked about in the class when we talked about depth, but here we'll put a horizon line. And then very quickly, because the sphere is occluding the horizon, yeah, it already pops a little bit. That gives it some depth. There's one more trick. If you want to make the light look really bright, or you want to give a little more form to the sphere, you can even erase some of up near the highlight and up near the top edge. Take away some of the line there. And then we'll shade that edge, but we won't shade the edge of the sphere into the sphere. We'll shade it to the other side, like essentially the background of it. And so we're going to basically be shading the negative space of the sphere, and you'll see what happens. And I'll do it kind of quickly here, but just to give you the idea. So we're defining that edge, which we sort of just erased, by the line around it, or by the edge around it, or by the tonal area around it. So sometimes I watch these videos also along with my son, that where video game players they're like professional video game players, and they're describing the game they're playing as they're playing, and they always say how hard it is to play the game and narrate at the same time, and I'm getting that effect for myself in the drawing. It's interesting to try and draw and talk at the same time, but anyway, it's good practice. Okay, so there you go. Maybe I can make it a little closer, if that's any better to see it a little closer. Yeah. There we go. There's an illusion of depth for sure. And there's all those parts that you can work on. The highlight can be made very tiny. Also, it's really interesting to move the light up and down, back and forth, and cast that shadow in different ways. That's also really good practice. and actually taking a ball, or another great one that there's a lot of videos online about is to do an egg. An egg is really fun. I did some of the eggs. I don't know if Shelly's here. I don't have my gallery view, but I've talked about this with other people. There's some good egg shading videos. These are some of the eggs I did this week. That'll pop up. There we go.
I'm here. I remember.
Similar, right? Yeah, you remember that, Shelly?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That Alfonso Dunn does a really good one. He shades it with little hooked lines and little hairy lines and circles. It's fun. So here, here again is the Terminator. The really surprising part to me is the Terminator is the dark part. So there's your Terminator. There's the reflected area. There's the cast shadow, the occlusion shadow, the highlight. And here the light is just right above the egg. So we just break down basic shapes. We did the cylinder before, and now we're looking at the sphere and this egg shape. And we just get comfortable with the idea that if we know where the light is and we know the curvature, we can kind of figure out where to start putting the lights and darks. And that's a big part of getting the illusion of depth to really work out. And yeah, just some practice on that is okay. How we doing on time? Oh, it's perfect. We're doing perfect. Great. Okay. So now this is going to be our longer drawing. I'm going to set you up to do some of this drawing, slightly longer drawing, probably 10, 15, 20 minutes or whatever, and then I have some pictures to show, which you can glance up at while you're doing it. Okay, I have to say one thing also, that the textured cylinders I saw this week blew my mind. It was really fun. It was really amazing to see. People had really, I think, great success and great fun in doing that, and it is an exercise that gives a lot back. So I try to find another one that was going to do something similar for us. Although this will be a little more challenging. You don't have to finish it all. You can, and I practiced a lot on it this week, and it varies a lot. There's a lot to play. So as we get slightly more complicated, sort of follow-alongs, then we get more possibility, and maybe you get more engagement in it. And I think I've enjoyed doing these renderings more now, getting them ready for the class and finding these exercises, than I ever really enjoyed rendering, which is not my favorite thing, even though I practice it. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to do a classic from painting and drawing, something from like classic era, like Velázquez and those guys, the classic oil painters. They would do fabric. That was one of the signature things. So we're going to try to do a little bit piece of fabric, but it's a don't get nervous. It's like a follow along. And what we need, the same way last week when we set out the cylinder and we looked at the value pattern, we got to set up a value pattern. So we're going to draw, the first thing we're going to draw is a rectangle, and we're going to set up a value pattern so that when we draw a shape, we can apply the value pattern, the pattern of light and dark, to that shape. The way when we did the cylinder, textured cylinder, we made sure we had the pattern of light and dark correct even when we drew other shapes on top of it. Okay. So what we're going to do is a plaid. And it goes something like this. Okay, and then it has two lines that go across. Okay, so that's like a plaid. And what we need to do is we need to shade now. We need to turn the lines the pairs of lines that go across into tone. And that's going to be our value pattern. So we have kind of a bright, I'd say, background, and then we have these kind of grayish stripes, and then make sure that where they overlap, is going to be, it can be naturally the way you do it, but I'm going to enhance it a little bit here. And that often helps. Okay, they're going to be a little bit darker. And there we go. That's like a piece of plaid fabric. Like a, make a scarf. We're going to make a plaid scarf. Okay. So that's our value pattern we're going to apply to the shapes we draw. And the shape we draw is going to be very familiar. It's going to be the cylinder shape, but we're only going to draw it about halfway. Half, maybe a slightly more, something like that. I'm not going to draw the whole base of the cylinder. We're just going to draw kind of like a C shape facing down. And then we're going to make the cylinder go back from each side and get a little more narrow as it goes back. Just because like with perspective, it's just kind of falling away a little bit. Okay, and then we can complete the back of it. It's a little hard to do from here, but there we go. Okay, so that's a piece of a cylinder. Everybody should be more or less familiar. That's that cylinder with, instead of going along the page horizontally, now it's kind of dipping back into space. Okay, now the trick here is to go to this point on the cylinder on the lower right-hand part of the cylinder. Okay, and then kind of following that line in the direction it's going, we turn it around and we turn it around this way like that. And we draw another kind of half cylinder the same way we did to begin. Turn it a little bit like that. Is that coming? There we go. Okay, go around like that. Okay, and then we're going to extend that back into space the same way. Okay. And here we're going to start not quite at the very end, but a little up from the end. And then we'll complete the other part of that cylinder like that. Okay, you can start to see it. And now we're going to extend. We're going to go back to that point on the next cylinder. We started this lower right-hand little point, and we're going to extend a little bit further. This time we're going to go another cylinder, and we'll just keep it rolling almost like a meandering river. Give it a few passes like that. So that's like a cylinder up, a cylinder down, a cylinder up. Those are the how we're thinking about them. Even though that edge looks like kind of like a river, and then we're just going to continue to complete those cylinders. But as we go now, we can get a little looser. You don't have to be quite so tight, and we can let the line get a little more bouncy. Okay. So what we're getting, hopefully you can see, it looks like some kind of folded fabric there. It's like something, you're getting a little occlusion and you're getting a little bit of rumpling. So now we're going to go a little further. One thing we can do is we can come underneath these and kind of put in the underside. That gives us a little more indication that it's kind of this fabric-y looking surface. Okay, now the real challenge, the fun of it, is that we're going to map our value pattern onto this, and I'll show you how easy that is. We just observe the curvature of the front and back of the cylinder, And we're just going to mimic that curvature. And there'll be 2 lines here. 2 lines here. They don't have to be exact in any place. But just so they kind of keep the spacing of the pattern. And then going back, we're going to draw our next 2. And if you run out of space, like here on the edge, you don't have to draw the other one. You can just use the edge as one of the lines. And then we're going to fill in our values. The same way, we're going to shade in between them. And where they cross over, we'll make that a little bit darker. Yeah. We'll do one more here. So now when you draw the next part of the pattern, it doesn't have to line up exactly because the cloth is a little bit folded, but it can be kind of close. Again, follow the curvature of the cylinder that you're on. Move it just slightly up or down. And there's one. Another thing, when you come front to back, you might start in the back at one point and then just, move it slightly outward from the center of the cylinder, like it might do if it was in perspective, the same way the cylinder changes its width at the distance. Okay. I noticed myself, I was really in the beginning especially concentrating a bit, and then I was feeling a bit fatigued from that, having to pay so much attention to the curvature, but I was very happy with the results. So we'll shade in again. And I'm going deliberately a little bit slow. You can do it quickly. I found after I got kind of the hang of it, I try to draw them fast on purpose. So if you're up on it, yeah. Okay, here we go. So there's the pattern starting to form. Another thing we can do to enhance is we can draw underneath this underneath part. We can make that dark. We can go to almost our darkest value in the underneath parts. And the last thing we want to do is that we want to remember not just the value pattern of the fabric, but we want to remember the value pattern of the cylinder too. So we can come back and lightly shade the way we were just practicing on the edge and bring those edges out, especially where it folds over that first transition between cylinder and cylinder. We can imagine a light up in this area, and we can shade behind that. So we can continue 2 value patterns.
Yeah.
Oh.
Can't smell somebody. It? I smell it.
Who is that?
It's definitely on.
Isabella? I'm going to mute you. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. All right, let me see how we're doing. All right, I'm going to look back at the gallery and see how we doing there. This camera. All right. Okay. Cool. Awesome. Sharon's working on it. Okay. Good. All right. So let me do a couple more on this one, and then you guys continue, and then I'll go to a couple of pictures. But yeah, let's just take a little time and work through each of the cylinders, trying to put our pattern on it. he starts to take on some dimension. And there's a complicated shape that broken down into parts is really not that hard to see how it's done. And then when you go back and you look at Velázquez and painters of that era, some of the Dutch painters who were more precise, doing folds of silk or doing curtains, that sort of thing, yeah, you'll start to see those patterns and how they were doing them. Then you look at someone like maybe Frans Hals and see that he could do it in 4 quick brush strokes because he could contain the shape and the value sort of all at once on the brush, and then a few highlights. Cool, I'm gonna let you work on that for a sec, or actually just continue to work on that. I'm gonna show you a picture. You can, I'll tell you when it's up. You can glance up at.
So John, before you do that, can you talk about, so in your upward part, it's kind of more wrinkly?
Oh, at the end.
Like the upper, what do you do with the wrinkly part?
You're talking about this area?
You follow sort of, yeah.
Toward the, yeah. So one thing you can do.
On the left of that,
sorry, I didn't hear you on that. I missed that, Julie. You could say it again.
well, that on that part where it's wrinkly, then you make the stripes sort of curvy the same way.
Exactly. Yeah. Try to follow. If you may, yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
That's okay. The audio is choppy, but I think I understand what you're saying. Yeah. What you want to do, even if you make the contour a little wavy or a little choppy, yeah, you want to just try to make your stripes follow that contour. So yeah, it can come along and you can mimic that, and that'll give you, maybe there's a fold there and you could give a little shade to that fold and then bring your, is that what you're asking?
I think so. I'm not even sure. Sorry.
Yeah. It's all right. It's there to be investigated. And I think what you'll find is as you start to play with it, stuff will come out. Like once you master a little bit of the straight ones there on the left, when you start to get in the more crazy shapes, it gets more interesting. And then the stuff that emerges, the stuff you see, and the little wrinkles become more interesting. So yeah, we can make this whole thing like it's under a shadow. And then we can make a shadow under there too. This can be bent back the other way, and then where it's like bent in, you can give a little more tone there where it's bent, where it might be underneath the light a little bit.
Thank you.
Yeah. They're pretty fun to do. I'll show you some of the ones I did in a sec. They bear a lot of experimentation. How you tilt the folds and how many folds and how you end them, and then where they occlude is also really interesting. This one's a little more work than the last one, but I think ultimately when you get the light going and you get the midtones going, it's pretty satisfying. And really all this in service of creating these illusions, creating this illusion of depth, where that takes you. Okay, let me get to this picture, because I want to talk a little more about illusion. Okay. Can anybody see that? Can you guys see that? Yeah, so look at that for 1 second. That's called the checker shadow illusion. This is actually, it's pretty widely written about now. And the whole thing about this is that's kind of unbelievable is that the square labeled A and the square labeled B are the same value. They're the same tone of gray. Impossible, I hear you cry. This is some kind of trick. There is a picture that I did to try to show it a little better. Oh, hang on. Here we go. Okay. So there it is. I took a little piece of the A and I sort of moved it down step by step to show that it connects to the A and connects to the B. Even then, when you look back and forth quickly from the A to the B, it doesn't look the same. But when you look step by step from the A to the B, it does look the same. So this is like a hole in the perceptual system. You want to think about it that way. It's like this is how our mind works to create an illusion so strong that it's really hard to believe otherwise. When we get to color, you'll see that Joseph Albers used this concept of contrasting colors to do a lot of his paintings, where he was able to make these squares where the center squares were the same color but look completely different, or were completely different colors and look more the same. He experimented with that perceptual capability. Okay, so I read a lot, and there's a lot in the psychology books and the eye-brain systems that people are talking about it. I read some of the comments, and one of the good ones says this. The guy said, "I don't think of this as an illusion. Rather, I see it as an illustration of what our vision system is doing. It is attempting to identify properties that are intrinsic to what we're looking at. And to achieve that is using both the information on light reflected off the surface and information on the ambient light level at the surface." So basically he's saying is our eyes, it looks like an illusion, but it's actually really what our eyes are doing. Our eyes are kind of, we're not seeing everything like a flat field. Like we think we look out and our eyes see everything the same, and our eyes look at everything the same, and it's not true. Our eyes are making tiny, and our brains are making tiny local adjustments to see details and shadows and to tone down highlights in bright areas so that we can take the whole scene in and we can compute it. And someone answered him, which I think was a good, kind of got me thinking. He said, "I agree. The only sense in which this is an illusion is that the scene itself is imaginary. When it confronted with an actual scene of this sort, our visual system functions correctly to determine the actual relationship between the intrinsic colors of A and B. In other words, the colors that we need to see locally to make the distinction. What blows my mind so much on these is that the A is on a black square and the B is on a white square, and so we just naturally know that they're different. This is way deep seated prejudice in our mind, or deep-seated talent in our mind. The same way when we first begin to draw and we draw the top of the cup as a circle because we know it's a circle. And it takes a long time to learn to look and to see. And when people make drawings with shadows, they often make the shadows way, way dark because they know the shadow is really dark. And so in the tonal range of the whole picture, yeah, maybe that tone in the shadow is not actually quite so dark. And when we get to color, you'll see that shadows are often colored. They're often colored on the surface they're falling on, but many people paint them in as gray and black. So things here are what they seem by contrast or by their surroundings more than any absolute value. And so we can think about how the context of things creates illusions around us. And here in the visual system, we're looking at it. In visual images, we see that the context creates the illusion. But there may be holes also in our perceptual system. It's been shown to work also in hearing, that, that the same sort of illusion, the brain will fill in tones in music the same way we're sort of filling in the tones here in visual, in taste. But also we construct the world from all the bits of information we get. And so our minds are constantly working in those little niche areas to explain things to ourselves. And that brought me to one teaching of the Buddha. Not that I'm advocating one set of beliefs or another, but it's interesting because they were so involved in perception and illusion and the mind. So it's interesting to look at what they had to say. And the Buddha says, constituting as it does a method by which people can come out of their conditions of suffering. So the Buddha taught a method how people could stop suffering. And the way he tried to do it was developing an awareness of reality. So begin to look at things and see how they are. Buddhism thus seeks to address any disparity between a person's view of reality and the actual state of things. In other words, we're looking at those illusions in the mind and the way things actually are. That's one of the great methods of Buddhism. And they call this right or correct view. The right view is understanding that what you're seeing is what your mind is putting together. Seeing reality as it is thus an essential prerequisite to mental health and well-being, according to Buddhist teaching. So being able to decode a scene and look at it and understand the tonal variations and the values, you know, is an essential part of learning how to represent that scene. And you know, if you represent it just as you think you see it, it will look strange. But if you go through all this kind of technical jargon and kind of measuring, really look at getting through all of the, you know, like when you have to sit in meditation and I guess suffer a little bit, but practice for sure, and a little bit of effort, it begins all of a sudden doing something that you wouldn't necessarily think is the way you draw it makes it turn out. Sometimes, you know, breaking down your thoughts, will help you see the illusion of what's going on. Okay, so let me stop that. And I'm going to put up a few of my ones that I did, just to give you some ideas. There's one. So I was just playing around. I was folding it. I did really loose. I found doing them loosely was fun. See if I have another good one. I tried to make a bigger one at scale. Okay, and I found the places where it crossed over were good indicators. Now, choosing the plaid and the exercise was not really arbitrary. It was, but if I'd have said we're going to overlay a grid on it, it might have been, you know, wouldn't have been so cool. Might have seemed like more like mathematical work or something. So yeah, but the plaid gives us a nice way to follow the contour lines. And also, I think those dark points where they cross over give us some great reference points in the drawing, and it really helps show the curvature in there. So you can see when you start to work with a more complex shape, and you start to break it down, yeah, if you can break it down into cylinders or into spheres or into boxes, which many shapes you'll draw, most shapes you'll draw, will break down at some point into cylinders and spheres and boxes. Then you can understand already a value pattern. And so the geometry of the shape, it's perspectival geometry, and the value pattern will already accelerate the illusion of three-dimensional space for you. And then, of course, there's all the other tricks, the occlusion and the background and the details and contrast and those sorts of things that you can put in. But that's a good broad, I think, pointing at ways of rendering, and that's a lot to work with there. So if you like that, and some people have emailed me and they want to go a little further on certain topics, and I'm happy to suggest ways to work, but I'm going to move to, I think, a little systematic drawing next. And that may give some relief if we're struggling with realistic drawing, but you're encouraged to, again, find the method that works for you and sort of stick with it. And so if we have any questions, or any comments, I've got a couple minutes, so be happy to hear. And again, thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to prepare for the class and to present it.
John, this is Terry speaking. I'm wondering what this word is that you used a lot. Inclusion or collusion. I'm not hearing it. Yes.
Yeah, occlusion.
Occlusion. What does that mean?
Yeah, when one thing is in front of another, it occludes it.
Oh, okay.
Like when there's an eclipse, the sun is occluded by the moon. Okay. And so one really simple, direct way to indicate depth in a drawing is to put one thing in front of another, or have that occlusion. And that's on the sphere, the very dark part. You'll notice when you work with shadows, especially if something rises above the ground, like where the things come in closest contact is where the shadow is the darkest, because that's a little kind of crevice where light is hard to get into. So even if two bottles are sitting next to each other, or something is sitting on the ground, right where it touches is really the dark little spot, and then the cast shadow from there becomes lighter. And that's just a little visual trick. Another thing, when you shade that, which took me a long time to get out, when you shade the occlusion part of the shadow, don't stop at the edge of the object, because the occlusion shadow doesn't stop at the edge of the object. That's the sfumato. That's the blending of the forms. Yeah. Shade right across it. It does a couple of things. One is you don't see the line because you don't see the stopping of the pencil right there. And the other is it makes this nice smooth blend between the objects, or between the object and the ground. So that's a shading trick. It took me a long time. When you're shading an edge, yeah, shade over the edge a little bit, because there is a little bit of the same tone on both sides of it, usually, unless it's very sharp, in which case, like in the sphere, in the highlight of the sphere, you can shade a sharp edge and just do the negative space around it if you want to indicate an edge that way. But otherwise, usually the edges share some tonality, and you can shade right across, and then you don't get a heavy line. The one rookie mistake that kills depth in shading is that after people do shading, they sometimes come along and put a heavy dark outline around stuff. And so when you see beginner drawing, you often see an outline drawn. And so if you do want to make an outline for proportion and for getting the contour right and the shape right, the best thing is to draw that really lightly, so that when you shade, it kind of disappears and you don't see that outline, and you use the shading to indicate the edge. And that'll give you a much more interesting and complex edge, and it won't flatten. That line on the side will flatten it'll make your eye see it more flat. So yeah, the classes are posted again on drawingyourownpath.com/blog, BLOG. If you want to go back, and I'll hopefully get this one up pretty soon. Any other final input or questions? And if not, I'm around, and you can email me, and thank you all again. I appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you very, very much.
Fascinating.